Okay, guys, Zach Evanish here. Welcome back to another Strong Life podcast. I am with Mike Glover, former Special Forces, Army, CIA contractor, and owner, operator of Fieldcraft Survival. We're going to link everything up over at zachevanish.com, but if you guys Google or go on Instagram, Fieldcraft Survival, you'll see a lot of different pages for Mike's stuff. You've got Fieldcraft Mobility. You guys are kind of branching out some interesting stuff. So, Mike, we're going through some interesting times with COVID-19. Your background, very interesting. Special Forces, working CIA. And before we get a little bit into your bio, I'm just going to say something interesting that will kind of kick this off. Is I have a buddy in the FBI, and before we went on this lockdown, I reached out to him and I said, hey, somebody texted me saying that we're going to go into a 2-week quarantine lockdown. Does that sound like something you know about? He's like, sounds like bullshit to me. 2 days later, the lockdown comes, and I texted him. I'm like, you're in the FBI. How did you not know this is going to happen? So I thought that was kind of scary, to be honest with you. And maybe he just didn't want to tell me. But let's give a little history of your SF background, military background, CIA. Then let's kind of get into this, where we are now and prepping for where we are now and what's to come.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thank you.
I spent the majority of my life, all the way from 17 to just a few years ago, in the military. I did 4 years in the infantry, and the rest of my time was as a Green Beret. So post 9/11, like literally the day after 9/11, I went into the pipeline for Special Forces, and then spent from 2002, when I went to selection, all the way to 2016, all the way from the ranks of E6 as a junior SF guy, Special Forces weapons guy, all the way to Sergeant Major. Deployed 9 times to war, was a sniper, was a JTAC, was a cell leader, was a team sergeant, and was an operations sergeant major for a special operations detachment that deployed to Africa. After I got out of the military, I got my college degree in crisis management and homeland security. I decided to pursue some government work. I was going to do it full time, but I figured I'd give the contracting realm a go before I committed full time. So I contracted with the CIA for about 2.5 years. Deployed another 6 times to Yemen, Pakistan, Iraq, Libya, all over the world, all over again. And then in 2016, decided I wanted to do something different, and I committed to my business, Fieldcraft Survival, which, our mission is to provide content, educational resources, training, and equipment for everything in the realm of preparedness.
Right. I've been looking, I'm in New Jersey, so I saw that you guys I looked at all the live trainings. New Jersey, I guess, canceled on you guys. I think you guys were coming out to work with state troopers. But
Yes. Yeah.
You're also, you guys are also doing stuff with civilians. And
Yep.
big reason why I wanted to get you on is a little bit selfish, is I've been watching a lot of your videos, whether it's on Instagram and YouTube. We've got some very unique times with COVID-19, and honestly, I thank my wife. She's kind of she gets paranoid of stuff, and she stocks up on things. And so for us, this is kind of the second time we've experienced something that's in the realm of, like a pandemic or some sort of lockdown. So 7.5 years ago, Hurricane Sandy hit the tri-state area. I live in a small beach town, 2 square miles, but the water went a mile inland. So it went, way past beachfront, mile inland, destroyed the homes. And what I saw was a lot of what you talk about in your videos, what happens when shit hits the fan, meaning there are these very affluent my town's very affluent, especially beachfront and the neighboring towns. There were, looters. There were people coming in on kayak from kind of, towns far away to rob a lot of these beachfront homes. And we are right next to National Guard and State Trooper barracks. and nonviolent crimes were not being stopped. There was no gas because of the power outage. I think we had no power for 14 to 16 days, and my kids were babies. This was 7.5 years ago, so my kids were like 2 and 4. And so we kind of always think, oh, this won't happen. A lockdown won't happen. We will never run out of food. We are America. We will have all this stuff. But I was able to see kind of that concentrated effect of what happens when shit hits the fan. And then with this instance, my wife saw this coming. She's a nurse. And so weeks prior, seeing all of these kind of admissions for strange flu-like symptoms, she knew something was coming. So she would go to Costco 3-4 times a week, stock up. And she told me that, one day I had a lot of stuff, toilet paper, food, and the lady in front of her says to the cashier, I'm not going to be a follower. I'm not going to do that. And so here we are, right, fighting for a lot of these, basic things. Toilet paper, food has been better, but I'd say like 2 weeks ago shelves were gone until supermarkets started saying, take only 1 carton of eggs, take only 1 thing of meat. So let's talk about this prepping, what we should have been doing, and also watching your videos, Mike. I essentially feel like you're saying like things might calm down soon, maybe in the summer, but then in the fall we will likely get sort of like a hit again with this virus as people start saying, you know what, it's time to, we can go back to work, we can chill out, maybe we're not taking it as serious. So I want to talk prepping, like for the family men, women, families. What should we be doing in the homes? And then we'll kind of expand into, you've got fieldcraft mobility with the vehicles, real interesting stuff. So let's talk about prepping for food, anything in-house, what you think we should be doing right now.
Yeah, I take a lot of examples from my experiences overseas. So when Americans operate, for example, in Afghanistan and remote fire bases, we are dependent on the American supply chain to supply us. So when I was in Afghanistan in 2005, I spent 9 months there in a remote fire base on the Pakistan border. And we didn't have the abilities to get a lot of resupply because of how far we were away from the main hub. And that caused a lot of issues because every 2 weeks you got resupplied. And then if there was a storm, for example, that came in, and I'm on the eastern edge of the Hindu Kush, one of the largest mountain ranges in the world. One storm could knock us out and put us 2 weeks behind. And then what happens if we get hit with a 107 millimeter rocket and it takes out our fuel blivet, which that happened while I was there. And so we didn't have fuel for our generators. So no power, no food. And this is working in an isolated area. Well, if you imagine that example and translating that to the way we operate in the United States, we operate that same exact way. We have supply chains that through distribution facilities distribute all the food to the local store that you have in your own community. Those, depending on the density of the population, could be 2 to 3 days worth of food on the shelves in your local community. And so if you imagine that the distribution chain or maybe even the manufacturing chain to the distribution breaks at any point, or there's disruption anywhere in between, you're going to look at potential disruption to the end consumer, which is what we've seen here on our ends. The biggest problem with the United States of America is because we are a world economy, meaning we operate internationally with exports and imports. We are very dependent on other world or other nations that are world economies for our own supply chain. That was proven when we had a supply chain issue with pharmaceuticals, because despite pharmaceuticals being made or manufactured in the U.S., the chemicals that are in the pharmaceutical medicines that we use are made in China or made in some foreign country. So we get to a point where you could see second and third order effects, a couple of things breaking before we go, oh, now this is affecting our lives. I always tell people, like, right now we're dealing with one pandemic, which is one natural disaster. Imagine if one major metropolitan area of San Francisco, Los Angeles, New Jersey has a natural disaster, a hurricane on top of the pandemic, a earthquake on top of the pandemic, a massive shooting or something of that's a man-made disaster on top of the pandemic. Then look at the compounding disruption that you potentially will see. So if you want to prep, look, I was teaching and advocating for prepping prior to the pandemic going down, because I want people to be prepared and independent from the government and from the supply chain. Because if you are solely dependent on one supply chain, it's just a basic understanding of contingency-based planning. If that breaks, you are going to be a victim of that breaking if you don't have diversification. So minimum recommendation of 30 days minimum of food, water, hygiene, pharmaceuticals, and the list goes on. That's a minimum. Depending on your circumstance, so the more rural and the more capacity that you have. If you have an apartment in San Francisco, then yeah, maybe it's difficult for you to have 90 plus days of food and water, hygiene, and everything else. But if you live in rural America or you have a home, then you have plenty of room and capacity. So a minimum of 30 days and becoming more independent off the grid. So more dependent on yourself. That could be degenerating. Like if you're dependent on the power grid and the power grid goes down, do you have a generator? Do you have fuel for other generators? I have a propane generator that I operate with that's 17 kilowatts. The power every single snowstorm routinely goes off for a week. Everybody in my neighborhood who's mostly above the age of 60 years old suffers for a week in the cold. And they don't have generators. That could be financial. That could be they're just lazy. The list goes on. But just that alone has allowed me to live normally in hygiene and bathing myself, cooking food, having lights and morale without dependent on the government. So I would look at generators. I would look at fuel storage. I would look at storing food. I would look at storing ammunition and guns. After the fact, when this took place, you had the spike of the most amount of background investigations, which translates to guns sold in American history in the month of March. That is a lot of people reacting instead of acting. A lot of the stuff that we teach, especially when it comes to behavior, is you never want to react to somebody's action. Reaction is always slower than action. So if I'm thinking offensively, especially in preparedness, I'm acting. I'm not waiting for something to happen and then reacting after the fact. Because like we saw with toilet paper and food, it's in short supply when there's a high demand.
Right. What's some of the food that you've had that you already had stocked up? And I'm pretty sure you are a hunter, and we have a wide range, of listeners. Listeners are age 20s to mid 40s with me, but also 50s, 60s, and 70s. And it also depends on where they live. So like listening to you reminds me of my wife's uncle. He's in Pennsylvania. He's got plenty of guns, plenty of ammo. He could hunt his own food. They've got a fireplace. He's got chickens in the backyard. He's kind of had this thought process, whereas I say people like me, entrepreneurs, we almost get too civilized because everything's so convenient. Then we're so busy working. You're a busy guy. You got a lot of stuff going on. What's the food that you had prepped up, or always had prepped up for the 30, 60, 90 days?
So a lot of people have this idea because it's convenient, again, even in preparation, that dry foods or MREs, meals ready to eat, is the solution. And I would think the complete opposite direction of that, because number one, meals ready to eat are so densely saturated with sodium that they're actually counter nutrient dense because of the sodium. And then they require a lot of water to sub out the sodium levels. What I tell people is there's only a few ways you can preserve food. That's fermentation, that's dry stored food, and that's freezing food. So I would have a combination, which I have, of all three of those. I have One, I have wild game because I am a hunter. I like to have elk, venison stored in my refrigerator in deep storage freezers because remember, we're not talking about the freezer cupboard inside of your convenient fridge inside of your kitchen. I'm talking about the deep storage freezer that's going to sustain that meat for a year in your garage. I have that, right? Because subsidizing your daily intake of protein with a meat source is super beneficial. Two, dry goods. I have dry rice, dry beans, dry foods that don't require any extra preservatives to preserve that long term. You could literally go to the store and buy a big thing of rice, put it in jars, seal those jars airtight, and put them away, and that will last you years. In fact, there's a window between 5 and 25 years depending on how you store it, especially if it doesn't get moisture to it. Another thing that I would do is ferment my foods. Jarring foods is beneficial because it gives you a window of about 1 to 5 years, but you could dry or you could jar and can specific types of food. If you jar it, you're usually using fermentation as a process to keep it stored. And this is what, I mean, I'm half Korean, so my family has been doing this forever. That's how they get through long winters throughout history to preserve food. Kimchi, cucumbers, radishes, vegetables of any kind can be fermented and can be easily stored for long periods of time. I'm a big fan of that because those are healthy means of storing foods as opposed to getting MREs and camp food for preservation.
Right. I saw one of the bug out videos that you and one of your guys, Kevin, did. He was talking about MREs are really they also just take up too much space if you have to walk and leave. And, to attest to that story, when Hurricane Sandy hit here, the lines to get gas, they were miles long. I don't know how many hours people waited online. But so what we had to do was there was people, you would see people walking, with gas. And on the flip side, people that were incapable of carrying that stuff. So they were not fit. And you know what, Mike, you said like this was the biggest influx of background checks for people reacting to buy guns. It's also any of my friends that own equipment companies, like you would know the names like Rogue Fitness, companies like that. They never sold so much equipment. They went like so far back on back orders. So people, like, was interesting to see where their priorities went. People were like, well, gyms are closed. I need to buy gym equipment. And so now we see price gouging on like Facebook and Craigslist. But with the power outages and things that can happen, a lot of people don't want to actually listen to that, Mike. You know what I mean? Meaning, when this Hurricane Sandy was coming, people didn't want to believe it would be that bad. So people were refusing to leave their homes. And so they had to get rescued by boat. I mean, there were sharks swimming in the streets. That's how much water there was. It was like a bad movie. And so, going from that, let's talk about preparing physically for when the shit hits the fan. And also, let's talk about first-time guns and ammo, which, because of violent crimes that are happening. You guys posted something on Facebook. I don't know what town that was, but somebody broke into a family home and the husband and wife were killed. So we're starting to see that will happen as people they get desperate. People who don't have anything to lose are going to resort to violent crimes, and they tend to go into these affluent areas. And then I also don't know if you saw something happened in, I think, Nova Scotia. A normal looking guy looked like sometimes you could kind of see it in people's faces, but I think he killed like 16 people. So we need to be ready physically and with firearms. So let's talk a little bit about those two things.
Yeah, I always default to, one, everything you're saying is just normal behavior, right? Freedom breeds complacency.
Yes.
It's just a characteristic of a complacent society because the freer you are, meaning the more you have in opportunities, then the more complacent you get, because you're like, why do I have to think about certain things like my coffee? I just go get my coffee and I get it made. Why do I have to think about my security? The cops take care of my security. And so, which is a huge detriment to society, I think, overall, because the more independent we are from the government, from the services that the government provide, the better off as a society we are when something like this happens. But I think independently, liberty-wise, as people, we're better off for that because we become more independent. Now, when it comes to like working out, look, I've been in austere environments like Libya, where I was in the middle of nowhere. We didn't have access to a gym. A lot of people are balanced mentally because of their physical balance, right? They go to the gym and it resets their mind, allows them to, strike a balance in a complex society where there's just task saturated. So it's good for mental health, and it's also good for resilience and survival. So I recommend everybody look at calisthenics. Pushing and pulling your own body your body is a gym. I mean, that's the title of a book written by a buddy of mine who's a former pararescue guy. Your body is a gym. So instead of spending money in something that, I would never say and devalue somebody spending money on gym equipment, because even for me, it's a value add, right? If I'm spending money on gym equipment and I'm working out from home, then I'm benefiting in a couple ways. I'm with my family. I'm at home. I'm social distancing, but I'm also getting the benefits of physical fitness. So it's never a bad thing. But I would say look at calisthenics, because pushing, pulling your own body in different ways, those prison yard gym workouts are going to allow you to stay fit and routinely, even in a lot of instances, more fit than you would typically be if you didn't look at calisthenics.
Right.
The push-up you could do in different degrees and angles and, elevated, etc., and then work your body without getting one piece of equipment. For firearms, look, the inherent right to defend yourself is a constitutional right, which is our Second Amendment. And I think it's important for every law-abiding citizen to be a law-abiding gun owner. Meaning I advocate for people who don't have guns to go buy guns, but to be responsible with guns. Meaning if we have a society where everybody is known to be armed responsibly, then we have a society of criminals and thugs who are less likely to take advantage of people in certain circumstances because they might get shot and killed by a law-abiding citizen. A pistol is the start point. A Glock 19, for me, I recommend in most instances for people to get a Glock 19 because it's a single action only pistol, meaning there's only one action required after the round is chambered, which is pulling the trigger. That's super important to understand, because if you're new to firearms and you're getting a 1911 that has a grip safety, that has a thumb safety, that has a different means of holding the gun because you have to activate that grip safety, then it could set you up for failure. I like Glock 19s, and I think before somebody buys a gun, you need to go out and get training, either locally or now online. We do virtual training. On my personal YouTube, on Mike Glover, I've done a whole bunch of free videos. In fact, right after this, I'm going to be doing a video on an AR-15 on basic nomenclature, safety, load, unload, and how to use an AR-15. Because I don't want to charge people for people to get base knowledge on how to operate a gun safely. I want them to understand that. But then I want to segue them into training pipelines for them to get training locally with law enforcement, with military, or reach out to do training. I've actually started doing virtual training where we do these courses on unlisted YouTube videos to provide that training for, I think our carbine or our pistol course is like $25. 3 hours of detailed training how to use a pistol that you can get while you're social distancing watching your TV. If you buy and invest in a pistol, invest in a holster, right? A shameless plug, we do sell holsters inside the waistband. Also get ammunition to practice and spend a lot of time holding that gun and working basic gun handling without bullets. There's a lot of things you can learn about your gun and yourself without going to a range or stepping foot on a range.
Gotcha. I love it. What do you have kids, Mike?
I don't have kids.
Okay. Let's say you have kids that are pre-teenage years or teenagers. What would you be teaching them about life with everything that's going on now? What are like the life skills, hunting, what are things that you would be teaching them? And I'm pretty sure I was watching maybe one of your videos, you mentioned like you live on a big lot of land. So just want to hear about kind of like these life choices you make and what you would teach or what you would encourage people to teach their kids.
That's a great question. The first thing I would encourage people, like, here's a statistic that's known in survival, but it's important for people to understand. Ages 1 to 6. So if you're an infant from ages 1 to 6, statistically in austere environments, infants have a higher survival rate than hunters in their age bracket. Ages 7 to 14, infants from 1 to 6 have a higher survival rate in austere environments, lost in the woods, than kids from ages 7 to 14. And that's because children who are 1 to 6 use primitive survival skills without cognition, right? They're not overcomplicating processes because they have to survive. An infant's cold, an infant will crawl to somewhere to get warm. It will crawl under debris, under foliage, inside of a tree. A child is tired. A child or an infant won't exert energy because it's trying to conserve energy. You take a child from 7 to 14 and they do the opposite because they have some parameters in cognition. They do understand decision making, but they often, because they don't have the experience to back it, they often make the wrong decision, which leads to bad outcomes. And then you take the hunters and they're in the same circumstance. They're drinking beer in a tree stand and they fall out of a tree stand on their neck and they're trying to survive in the woods. So it starts with educating children cognitive processes and right decision making, right? Which means giving them the benefit of the doubt and working through mental modeling with them. So that starts with a Q&A session. Hey, son, if you were in this circumstance, what would you do? Well, Dad, I would do this. Oh, well, that's the wrong answer, but let's talk about why it's the wrong answer. And let me give you the right answer. Acronyms in emergency procedures or processes. Remember, kids aren't able to reflect cognitively to a decision-making matrix to make and adapt to decisions, right? So they don't go, hey, this is a bad circumstance. I'm not really sure what to do here, but let me think about it. And then they have a positive outcome. If you give a child an emergency process via an acronym, hey, remember I told you to stop, look, and listen. Every time something goes bad, you need to stop, look, listen, take in the information, and then make a decision. Then they might revert back to that acronym. So that whole thing I'm talking about really is instilling mindset, right? Children need to be taught how to act, not how to react under stress. So if a child is experiencing some stressful circumstances, we can give them the solution. And then we can teach them how to cognitively decision make the right solutions. That's paramount in mindset, right? Because often we find in survival at the bottom 10%, which is the bottom of the barrel, which often are children, they make the wrong decision because they don't understand or they don't know better. I also would focus on teaching our children a warrior mindset. Now, I get often asked, what's a warrior mindset? I think a warrior mindset in modern society is a resilient mindset, meaning if things are going wrong, we teach our children not to quit, right? If things are going wrong, we teach our children to get back up on their feet and to stand up or to fight or to be stronger, because it's not about if things are going to go wrong, because they will go wrong. It's about what you do when things go wrong. So teaching mindset and resiliency means giving our children challenges, letting them fail, and then working through the process of getting back on their own 2 feet and being more resilient and dealing with failure. because so often we live in a society which is known as the participation trophy society, where everybody's created equal, except catastrophe and disaster is an equal opportunist. It doesn't care what you are, who you are, it will destroy you. So if we teach our kids to bounce back, we are giving them opportunities to fail. We're putting them in sports. We're putting them in challenges. We're offering them exposure to difficult circumstances, which could just be camping, which could be a difficult workout, which could be mowing the lawn, where they're tired and fatigued and they come in and they say, hey, I don't want to do this anymore. Well, you don't have an option because you're going to work through this. What do you need? Let me help you get through this process. Martial arts. When I was a kid, when we were kids, we grew up with martial arts, karate, kung fu, taekwondo, because that was a good base of discipline in broken homes when you didn't have a father figure kicking you in the butt and telling you how to do things. That's a good start point for me. There's so much more to that, but that's a great question.
So let me segue. We kind of we're talking about kids and how they're just sheltered. I don't know if you guys go into the schools and ever do this, but I'm a strength coach at a high school in my late 90s, early 2000s. Even when 9/11 happened, we're like 45 minutes from New York City. We're kind of taught, everything is taught to like hide. So when if there's a lockdown in the school because somebody intrudes the school, everybody's taught to like hide in a corner. I just give me some thoughts on that and what you would do if you were going into the schools. I mean, usually it's one person entering the school.
That's super problematic, right? The acronym is actually run, hide, fight. And the reason the government teaches run, hide, fight, because it wants to limit liability.
Right.
When an institution institutes parameters for emergency procedures where people are dying, the government's thinking from the legal standpoint of, I want to limit liability overall. Right. So we want our kids to run away from the circumstances, which means displacing themselves physically, and we want them to hide. The inherent risk and the inherent problem in hiding is you're setting yourself up for failure. Because if I'm hiding, I'm not in a posture to be able to fight. So it's like run, hide, and then desperately fight. Because we've all played hide and seek. If I tell kids to go hide, they're going to put themselves physically in compositions where they don't have the ability to fight, because they're going to be underneath a desk, inside of a cupboard, inside of a closet at the bottom of it. So if discovered, they're in no position to fight. So one, I tell people, like, our acronym is observe, fight, and flee, or flee and fight inversely. So you're always prepared to fight, but you need to observe to take in the information to determine your course of action, right? If people just react off emergency procedure acronyms without thinking, they could put themselves in a worse situation than they were in the bad circumstance. An active shooter comes into the east wing of the school. Well, they run to the west wing because run. So then they run, but then they remember it's hide. So instead of going out the exit of the west wing of the school, they run into a classroom and then run into a closet of a classroom. And then the shooter goes door to door, killing everybody, which happened in Virginia Tech. So if I observe and I take the information, and then my intent is to flee, which should be the intent in an active shooter if I don't have the ability to fight, I am going to do everything I can to get out of that circumstance. I don't care if I'm throwing desks through windows or if I'm throwing myself through a window, right? We have to teach the kids that the alternatives here, or you potentially die because you're putting yourself in a bad circumstance, or you flee any means necessary. So, but we set them up with the preparation and the mentality and then the physical posture ready to fight. Because ready to fight is different from hide. Ready to fight means I run behind a door and I grab a fire extinguisher and with my buddy hits low and I hit him high because that's all we got left, right? that posture and that disposition is completely different than cowardly hiding with a last resort of thinking to fight as a desperation, which I can tell you this from doing case study reviews on active shootings where a lot of people, including children, have died. When a child hides and then a person finds them who's willing to do harm to those people, the outcome is never good.
Well, I'm wondering, it's been, these shootings in the schools. I mean, they've been going on for 2+ decades, certainly more prevalent the past decade. And just the stuff you're talking about, like attacking. And I'm just thinking to myself, I was born in Israel, and then my brother was in the Israeli army. And then when my grandparents were alive, I would travel back and forth every few years. So I just remember the security of, going on El Al flights and seeing the undercover soldiers, and even going to a wedding, like everybody's dancing and there's a Glock in the back, on everybody. And so I'm wondering what it will take for government to bring in somebody like you to train schools so that people would be more afraid to come in and do these things, meaning the teachers are trained in firearms and, the students are trained in, some schools do it, they teach judo, and of course you have your wrestlers and whatnot, but, will we ever get there, Mike? Will we ever get to a point where it's not like hide, be afraid versus don't fuck with us?
Yeah, I think, I think unfortunately it's going to take some compounding bad circumstances to get people at the policy level to be able to enact change, which, means federally.
Sure.
But locally, we're trying to affect our community as much as we can. So locally, we do provide that service. I've taught schools. I've taught law enforcement for free. It's not part of our business plan. It's part of our giving back plan. And I think it's super beneficial for whether you're a law enforcement officer that's assigned to a school or you're a teacher or a parent that's affiliated with a school to reach out and do your own due diligence. Because remember, it's never important unless it's an issue, right? Right now, the pandemic's the issue. Nobody even cares about shootings that are going on. The Canadian shooting in Nova Scotia got like this much coverage and 16 people died. There's shootings all over our communities and it's not getting a lot of attention. And we should be taking this opportunity like in this lull, because we have a societal lull in fire where we have the opportunity for the first time to get some virtual training, to focus on different things. And, it does activate things in my mind where I want to talk about this openly. I've done podcasts on it, on the Fieldcraft Survival podcast. I've done a lot of speaking engagements, but maybe I need to virtually do this on my video camera and then upload it to YouTube so people don't forget, because it is important. Look, mass shootings is not a systemic issue in our society. It just isn't comparatively. 40,000 people a year die from firearms. 60% of that 40,000 die from their own hands via suicide. About 300 plus people die in mass shootings a year out of that overall number. And that's just not a lot. I mean, more people die in a 48-hour period from the flu during flu season. But does that mean it's not important? No. Does that mean that I don't think teachers should be – look, if teachers could academically go get educated in 4 years, some with master's degrees, some with PhDs, academically, they could go to a week-long training session to learn how to be armed to protect their students. I don't see the problem in that. If I was a teacher, I would want to be armed, and I would be armed. I don't care what the school system says. I would defend my children, and I'm not going to use a book or a fire extinguisher to do that. If I'm a teacher and I don't have the benefit of getting that training, but I have a principle that's squared away, I'm going to do my best to get that training. I do think, like, Israeli is an armed society, right? They have people who are in the Israeli Defense Forces that walk around with Uzis, with M4s, with pistols.
In the mall.
And that armed society is a
Yeah.
better protected society.
You go to the
That's a good
mall.
example of that.
Yeah, you go to the mall and yeah, they're carrying. The last time I was there was when there was like a heavy duty series of bombings in Lebanon, the bus bombings. So that was like half my lifetime ago. I was in my early 20s, mid 20s. And it was interesting how security increased, tenfold on the streets. You're driving down a highway and then they have those, spikes to slow you down. And
Yeah.
and then here I am living in like, a nice town, a place we want to raise our kids. And I think of like Lake Parkland, Florida is just like that. We go down that way a couple times a year. And so I have like a concern and I want to put it out there for people because we move to these nice, safe areas. And I always feel like that's where people target because they know.
Look, if you're a bad guy, you're going to target the weakest targets, right? The opportunistic, weak targets that are going to be able to be exploited. And so, the physical security standard operating procedure is if you want to mitigate risk, you posture security. So you have police officers, you have security officials. And then you advertise it, right? Because if you don't advertise it, you don't want covert security in schools. You want it to be known that every teacher in that school has a firearm. You want to let it be known that every school in that district has a police officer that's a member of that school. With that being said, people who want to do evil things are going to target and exploit those opportunities. And if it's not the school without the security officer, it's the Walmart with no security whatsoever. That's just a way that society is. You're going to have evil people doing evil things. My question is, as a public institution, is it the public institution's responsibility to provide security for my child in that school when I'm giving them up to provide mandatory education that's publicly provided? And that answer should be yes, always. Like if I'm giving my child up because it's a requirement in states to allow our children to go to school and it's mandated, then why wouldn't it be mandated for them to offer and provide the protection for those kids?
Yeah, some schools, we see now they have the cop cars in front, or they're putting cops in the schools. The first time I came across your stuff, Mike, was actually, I think, from one of your guys on the team posting like photos of his TRD Pro, like all tricked out maybe. And so what it got me thinking about for this call was, I see you've got the truck, you're working on the Porsche. I feel like even myself, becoming an entrepreneur, doing all the work, it's a different world compared to when I was a kid. I used to see all the time younger guys, adults working on cars in their garage or in their driveway. Like we could do things with our hands. And my gym is located next to two auto garages. One guy does a lot of work like what you guys do, like works on Jeeps and things like that, and lifts. The other guys do transmissions. How important is it to be able to do these, rig up our vehicles and work with our hands? And is that you that does the work, or you work with other guys that, you've got the Fieldcraft Mobility on Instagram, so I see the vehicles you guys are working on. How important is that, and why are you doing it? Is it not just a hobby? Is it because you are kind of prepping for maybe things to come?
Yeah, I look, mobility, or your vehicle, simply put, is an extension of your overall capability. If the idea is you want to get out of a bad circumstance and you don't have a vehicle, then it's going to be a lot more difficult without a vehicle. Everybody in the United States, for the most part, there's more cars than there are people in the U.S. So we depend on vehicles to come and go. Now, when I was in the military, vehicles served multiple purposes, including fighting from our vehicle, living from our vehicle, extending our range and our capability, but also providing a means to bugging out from a bad situation to a better circumstance. So I encourage people who are interested in preparedness to look at their mobility platform in that way. The simple example is, if you're thinking about first aid equipment, and you carry a tourniquet, like I carry a tourniquet everywhere I go. I carry a tourniquet because as a responsible citizen of my community, I want to be able to help somebody who's in need, but I also want to provide the support to myself and my family and friends. So when I look at my vehicle, that is an extension of my capability. We call it an extension of your rucksack. So now I'm not going to have a tourniquet in my vehicle. In my trunk, I have a first aid kit, an entire bag full of first aid medical equipment. Just like I look at my house as a hospital, right? If I have the ability to treat out of my mobility rig an upgraded level of care, then I want that advantage for my home as well. So I want meds, pharmaceuticals, antibiotics. The list goes on. So what people need to understand is there are many historical references in modern history of people being stranded, either in gridlock traffic because of an ice storm, broken down in the middle of a rural environment, and dying, or being stranded for multiple days and then being dependent on a tow truck, a first responder who can't get to them. So when I look at my platform, it's a platform to get out of a natural disaster, get out of a bad circumstance. The first thing I look for in platforms is the range of my platform. There's a lot of guys who have these tricked out survival rigs, and they have $100,000 invested in a Raptor with all this sexy stuff. But I routinely ask these guys when I see them, I say, how much gas do you have in your vehicle? A quarter tank. That's your capability, not your $100,000 rig. The quarter tank of gas you have in it because you have no access to gas. What do you do in a hurricane when the gas station shut down? Or the power shuts down, so the gas stations can't manually pump gas.
Or once they ran out of gas, and the power was out, then they ran out of gas, then they couldn't get refueled. So there was like 2 weeks of no power, a lot of damage from this hurricane, and it was like, I'll tell you, Mike, it was remind me of like a movie. Or when I watched the Hurricane Katrina, New Orleans, I had a friend I have a friend that went through that. I watched it on the news, but then it doesn't hit you until it's right in your backyard. And you're like, people are like, hey, Zach, you should do a fundraiser. And I'm like, fucking fundraiser? I need to find hot food for my kids. Like, I can't be creating ebooks for a fundraiser for everybody else. It was interesting how people were like disconnected from what was going on, but it was wild. So the guy with a Ford Raptor, all tricked out, quarter tank of gas. I've seen, I think one of your trucks has like a extra. You rigged something up in the back, like an extra gas tank.
Yeah, you could. The one of the most important things that I think is necessary in preparation is the capability to extend your fuel range by harboring fuel. And that could be an extended fuel tank on your rig. Like I have what's called a Titan fuel tank that's underneath where my spare tire carrier would go, which allows me to have 30 extra gallons. It doubles the capacity of my rig. I've also have the 75-gallon version that goes inside of the truck bed, which I was able to drive from Phoenix to the Canadian border on one tank of gas. I also encourage people, if you don't have the money because they are expensive, then you can do an Amazon version of this. On Fieldcraft Mobility, I put out a tutorial on what to buy, 12-gallon flat-packed tank from Amazon, a manual bulb pump, and the hookups to put it inside the tank. Costs $115, which allows you to, for most cars, nearly double your capacity. And so if you think about range, like even in the quarantine, if things would have got really bad and stuff would have shut down supply chain wise, and you had that, then you had the ability to double your fuel range which for most vehicles is hundreds of miles. So that way you don't have to depend on siphoning gas or stealing resources. I mean, back to the armed component of why we are armed. Imagine you're a father and you have an infant and you need formula for your children and you don't have gas and you don't have the ability to walk 20 miles to the nearest gas station. What are you going to do in desperation? Well, you probably first start off by asking. But if you ask and you can't receive, then you're probably going to take, right? You're probably going to do your best because I'm not going to let my kids die because of gas. So what are people willing to do in desperation of defending their own? And, to each their own, but I'm worried about mine. So how am I going to defend mine? Well, one, you should have thought about this from the get-go in preparedness. Two, you should have the contingencies in place to be able to defend life or potentially get what you need to get in order to ensure that you survive.
So if you're stocking up on extra gas, then you need some sort of stabilizer in it, right? Because how long can gas sit idle for?
It depends. So it depends. If it's cycled through, which I encourage people, like most people who get gas, like you get gas for your lawnmower, it sits in your garage for 6 months, but you're cycling through the season because you're constantly filling it and using it. So what I tell people is if you have a chainsaw, if you have even if you have a car in that flat pack version, you could routinely every once in a while get practice with your family of taking that bulb, transferring the fuel from the flat pack into your tank, go refuel it every couple months, every 90 days, and keep it cycled fresh. If you have a tank that's a steel tank that has the ability to retain it, to seal it off, you're looking at years that you could retain that fuel for periods of time.
Okay.
So that obviously is a different scale of financial responsibility, but routinely cycle through it and you'll be okay.
And who's working on your truck? You do that, or you have a group of guys you go to?
So I use Summit off-road depending on what it is, but I'm also mechanically inclined. I was a mechanic for a period of time in my life. And you could watch a YouTube video that teaches you how to build a 350 engine from scratch, a 350 small block from scratch. So if you could use YouTube to do that, you could use YouTube for everything. More important than I think going to mechanic school is getting all the reference material. That includes the Shilton manuals. That includes the YouTube references on a standalone hard drive, the PDF files for all the things that are related to your vehicle, and then learn as you go. If stuff breaks, look at that reference material and fix it on your own. Watch YouTube and fix it on your own. If you have equipment, for example, these new cars that are dependent on PCUs and ECUs because it's a strategy for the manufacturer and the dealerships to make more money, then you need to get basic, simple vehicles as part of your contingency plan. I call them EMP-proof vehicles, which is electromagnetic-proof vehicles. If the grid goes down or there's an EMP attack, you have the ability to not fry circuitry, which disables your rig. But more importantly, have something that's simple, that's reliable, that doesn't even have to have 93 or 91 octane in order to operate to allow you to get around. That could be a fun truck that's a couple $1,000 investment.
Yeah, I was just yesterday looking at trucks on Craigslist, and there's some stuff for pretty cheap. So what do you have? What's the big truck? Is that a Dodge? What do you drive?
That's a Dodge Ram 2500 with a 6.7 liter Cummins diesel engine.
Diesel.
I'm a big advocate for diesel engines, especially when it comes to capacity of carrying weight.
Yeah. Because
you're typically over 1-ton axles. The average weight's about 3,500 pounds. Most people's Toyota, 4Runner, high-speed kitted out rigs only have a weight capacity of about 1,500 pounds, and that includes personnel that are in the vehicle.
You did
so
a
you
video
take me
on
at
that.
240,
Yeah.
You take George at 260. We're already 500 pounds into this, so
Right.
You need to have a rig that can carry the weight, but also that's reliable.
You did a video on that, and I guess you asked people what they were driving. A lot of the people were driving Toyotas, either Tundras or Forerunners, and really loving them. And then so you've got that, you've got the Porsche, and anything else you're working on?
I have a 73 Land Cruiser. That's an EMP proof rig. That's an old FJ40 with a 350 small crate engine in it. We're swapping in a 5.3 Vortec, which is a suburban engine that you find in any modern day Chevy. But again, the overall point, like for example, people ask me, why are you building a Porsche rally car? And the reason I'm building a Porsche rally car is to show people that you could take a car and with a few modifications, including tires, suspension and clearance, adding additional extended fuel tanks, you could take your Honda Civic and just make it a little bit more capable of moving off-road and then traveling off-road. That Porsche 911 is a rear-wheel drive vehicle. If you go into the Middle East, most vehicles that are on crappy roads in the Middle East are front-wheel drive vehicles that have maybe upgraded tires, but they're light, but they have the ability to go overland or off-road. You don't have to have an expensive rig or invest a lot of money in looking at your rig as a benefit to you in a bad situation.
What about thoughts on, I remember asking Andy Stump this a couple years back, purchasing the used military vehicles from auctions, or are they just too beat to shit, like a Humvee? They look pretty beat up.
Most of those, a Humvee is a pretty reliable vehicle if maintained and serviced. The AM generals are not very good in civilian life. One, they're too wide. Their wheelbase is too wide. So if you're going down narrow paths, especially in national parks, national forests, BLM, then you won't have that advantage. Routinely, I think I give advice to most people telling them, look, Jeeps, old Toyota Land Cruisers, including FJ40s and FJ80s, and then old pickup trucks that have small crate 350s are super good, reliable rigs that you could have a small box of parts and components and tools that will fix 90% of everything you run into on the trail.
Yeah. Man, I missed the guy that was next to my gym moved out to Utah, and he had he may have had a Ford F-350, but my wife has an F-150, and he's like, this truck will go forever. He's like, maybe down the road you get a new engine in it, and he was tricking out a lot of like Jeeps. They were doing all that off-roading stuff. But when Hurricane Sandy hit, he was able to just, he had a lifted truck and Jeep, and he's like, I build stuff to go through this shit. I know you're busy on time. Let's close out with this, Mike. You've said it. Any research I do in the medical community have said it that, COVID-19 might start to chill out a little bit soon. But then when we return back to work, schools and universities reopen in mid to late August and September, of course, we'll likely see a spike again of this. What, intel do you have or knowledge or even just how you kind of put these, put two and two together? What do you see coming up in the fall and any prep, tips for that?
Here's my concern. One, there's a major concern because most scientists who are involved in studying COVID-19, meaning the experts, have unanimously determined that the heat is not going to deter the virus. Remember, this is not influenza. So people keep assuming that the same timeline that you see in a wave where you have a seasonal flu in the winter that resurges in the fall time because of the hot weather. This is not influenza. It's a COVID, meaning a novel disease. COVID stands for corona infectious disease, right? Coronavirus infectious disease. So this is not potentially going to be suppressed by the hot weather. So what you are likely to see is when the states free up and allow people to reassimilate. I think, one, bringing schools together this soon is a mistake. Because look, here's my thing, and this is the libertarian in me, this is the conservative in me, this is the politician guy in me. Small businesses need to get back to work. If you have Walmart opened with social distancing parameters, you should have every small business available and open for business, because now we're putting the onus back on individuals to be responsible. But if you're a responsible business owner, you're also regulating your own business by maintaining social distance protocols. It's what I do in training. People show up, they need a social distance. I'm giving them the benefit of the doubt, but I'm also enacting responsible measures in order to facilitate the big picture. What I don't like is academic institutions bringing students and kids in classrooms together. Because there's no point in that,
right?
Especially if we could do it virtually, right? Which I think our institutions are not progressing or evolving anyways. They haven't evolved with the fact that a kid has to be in a classroom to somehow get that same POI, that period of instruction, that he can get virtually and probably beneficially get more out of it virtually. I don't think people should be amassing at sports events. I think you will see a second wave, which will be this summer. The timeline on that is about 3 weeks after they allow everybody to reassimilate, because 3 weeks is about the time period you'll see everybody who's not infected being asymptomatic, reinfecting everybody else. And then within a 2-week window after that 3 weeks, you'll see them going to the hospital. You'll see them getting infected. And then you'll see the cycle all over again. Now, then you'll be at a weird rebound point, which you'll have to decide, do we just go back to quarantine? Which most people will say, we're not going to do this again, right? The American public in North Carolina, in Michigan, in Illinois, in South Carolina, in Georgia are already protesting the fact that they want the independents to make their own decisions, which I primarily think is a responsibility. In fact, if I had kids that were in school, my kids would not be going to school. I would still be homeschooling. But that doesn't mean I would stop living my life. We would still be going out, but we would social distance. We would wear masks. From the very get-go, in February, before this became a thing in the United States, I was doing posts talking about wearing a mask, because the only, and it came out later, the only reason the CDC said don't wear a mask is because they wanted to retain the mask for themselves. I thought it was asinine for these assholes to come out and say, don't wear a mask. It's not going to help. Like, what planet do you live on? Why would you think a mask with a virus that is spread through droplets, or now we understand aerosol in conversation, wouldn't work? So now it was a big scam. We should have been wearing masks from the very get-go, because it's not about not getting sick from you. It's about me, if I'm asymptomatic, not spreading it to you, right? So it's suppressing. So wearing masks, social distancing. In fall, you're bound to see a third wave, because there will be a significant resurgence, because this virus, outside of it not being suppressed by hot weather, more than likely will resurge because this is just me spitballing, but maybe UV light related, right? More heat doesn't necessarily mean killing the virus, but it might mean making it less contagious. So this third wave will hit, and then you'll have states again saying, how are we going to manage this? To prepare for that is what you should have been doing in the first place. Stocking food, minimum of 30 days, stocking hygiene, stocking water, becoming more independent and reliant on yourself and not the government, and then social distancing, and then wearing masks. Like, all of those parameters, all those things you should be doing right now anyway. I'm an introvert. Despite me socially communicating a lot on social media, I don't fucking like people, right? I don't want to be around a lot of people in the first place.
Right.
If I'm around people, it's because I'm training them. Become a better introvert. If you're one of my ex-girlfriends that likes to go to the clubs and the bars, then you probably want to stay away from that, right? If you want to go out and have a Friday evening on a date at a crowded restaurant, again, take the opportunity to use this time to spend it with your family and your friends, social distance away from the bulk of people together. And that's going to help.
And then quick question, you're traveling, so all flights are canceled. You're driving or how are you?
So we're finding niche flights because this is something I was educated on. It's cheaper to keep the airplane flying than it is to ground it because of the maintenance requirements. Also because planes fly a lot of cargo. So I'm flying to South Carolina tomorrow, business class, on a plane that's probably going to be me and my media guy, right? I'm going to train in South Carolina, which is one of the states that this Friday, which is tomorrow, is going to free up a lot of the circumstances because of their numbers. Look, South Carolina's and a lot of the South are more rural anyway.
Yes.
So they're going to have better numbers. But they start institutionally or recreationally assimilating a lot of people, you're going to see the resurgence. When I train, there will be 6 foot of separation. There will not be handshakes and bro hugs. We'll do our training on the flat range, get the training objectives knocked out, and then we will be on our way. I do not intend to spend a lot of time on top of people, even talking to people in close proximity, because I don't want to get my family and friends sick. It will be a detriment to our abilities to train people. And you know what? Nobody's called us an essential business, but nobody's told me to shut down. But the first time somebody comes up on my doorsteps and tells me to shut down, I'll just go home and run my business from my house.
Right.
I am not going to shut down. And the fact the government at the local level is dictating who's essential versus who's not, and it just so happens the essential businesses are mass corporations, I have a huge problem with that.
Right. I was watching maybe an Instagram live or one of your videos. So, in my area, the restaurants are doing you could do takeout, but what's interesting is Dairy Queen is open. And I guess because they sell, food, even though it's processed food, it's packed. People are nonstop going.
Of course.
Yeah, people are nonstop going in there. Any questions that I didn't ask that you wish I would have asked to kind of cover this? Talking about prepping and just being ready. And any questions you wish I would have asked?
No, I think one, I would advise everybody who wants to get into prepping, you don't have to spend money to be prepped. If stocking food is spending money, you're spending money for food that you're going to eat one day. I even have a stock supply of things that I like to eat because if something happens, I want to eat that stuff, but it doesn't have a long of a shelf life as other foods, but I cycle through it. So the only thing you have to do is change behavior and patterns in your life. Our lives are dictated by the everyday habits that we institute. The only thing we're asking that you guys do is change a couple of your habits, and be diligent in that way. Because what you're doing when you're prepared is you're alleviating a lot of pressure from the system that's helping people who are dire. Not everybody can prep. If you're a 75-year-old elderly woman in a retirement home, you don't have the luxury to do that. If you can't drive, if you can't sustain your own food. So not everybody can do that. So everybody that's on board is allowing the system to help those who desperately need it, who are desperately sick, who are in desperate need of help. And I think that's a citizen responsibility. But also, I'll end this by saying it's also fun. Living a lifestyle of preparedness means I'm driving cool shit. I'm living a cool life. I know I'm not dependent. And when you replace preparedness for paranoia, you're truly living a liberated life. And I think that's what every American should do in the first place, because I think from the origins of our beginnings, that's what they intended to do, not create a system which made us holistically dependent on a government institution.
I got a last question for you then, actually, Mike. I was thinking, as I'm speaking with you, thinking of my wife's uncles in Pennsylvania, a buddy of mine outside of Austin, just different people. So you're out in Arizona, and when you're looking to move somewhere, place of living, whoop, you hear me?
Yeah, I got you.
Okay. So when you're looking to move, let's say you're going to move again, what things do you look for as to what piece of property you're buying, and what do you look for? Hey, this is where I'm going to live for my life,
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I have a vegetable garden on my property. I have chickens. I like sustaining my own staples, especially with things that I routinely eat. I would look at a minimum. Look, you don't have to live on land. You could actually do it in your own home or apartment with no land. But if you're looking for a segment of land, it's not even important that you necessarily have the proper soil, because you could introduce topsoil. Most people who garden don't utilize utilize the soil that's in their environment. They bring in topsoil from a gardening place and then put it in buckets and in bins or whatever it may be. So what I would advise people to do is look at potentially getting the mineral rights to their land, because I think it's advantageous if you could tap an aquifer or tap a natural spring or already have a well, a natural well on your land. That's paramount, right? Because water grows plants, it feeds chickens, it allows you to do a whole bunch of things independent of the grid. So that's first and foremost. Second, I would look at enough land to be able to put at least a 6 foot by 6 foot small garden house. And your garden house could be it could be sticks and tarps, right? We're insulating an environment that plants can grow. That requires you to understand how plants grow, understanding what type of seedlings you could use, what type of soil to introduce. I would also encourage people to look at how to introduce compost. We waste a lot of biomaterial that's advantageous in compost to be able to grow food. A compost pile with your vegetable skins, your banana peels, your beer, leftover beer, whatever it may be, is going to be hugely advantageous in a barrel to introduce to your living situation for growing food. I would look at a property that's not hindered by homeowners associations. I refuse to live in a neighborhood that has an HOA. If you won't allow me to have chickens in my neighborhood, then I'm not going to have an HOA. Hens don't cock-a-doodle-doo, right? If you have a hen, they're not making a lot of noise, but most HOAs don't understand that, so they won't let you have a couple hens to lay eggs. That's paramount for me. I go through 20 eggs a freaking day. I eat a lot of eggs. It's a staple of my diet, so I want to be able to depend on my circumstance. A small hen house could be anywhere from 2 by 2 feet for one hen to 6 feet for a few hen. It's not that much, but HOAs inhibit your ability to be able to do that. Lastly, if you're looking at to segment a large piece of property, the minimum for me would be a half of an acre. I live on half an acre, but I also look to be backed up against BLM or National Forest. Remember, if you are accessible, or if you're accessed to public land, the limitations on what you could do for hunting small game and big game, or using those natural resources that tie into you, are super beneficial. In Colorado, I have 2 million acres in my backyard of San Juan National Forest. In Prescott, I have 1 million acres of BLM in the Prescott National Forest in my backyard. Get a property backed up against BLM or National Forest as an advantage.
Awesome. Mike, this has been great. Fieldcraftsurvival.com. I will link all of the social channels and even embed some of the videos you guys have been doing on the website. And thanks to everybody for listening for the Strong Life podcast. Check out what Mike's doing. Great stuff. Traveling all around, doing a lot of seminars, a lot of different training, from not just firearm stuff, but also I think I saw something you guys were going to do, some like prepping seminars. So,
we're doing prepping seminars. We're doing bugging out courses. We're doing mobility courses. The list goes on. We're trying to attack it all with my team. I got some really good guys that are part of this team who are subject matter experts in their experiences, and we're putting them to work. So check it out at fieldcraftsurvival.com.
Great. Hang tight while I shut it down, Mike.
Thanks, man.